Hello and welcome to another episode of the Truth C Squared podcast. My name is Shmez, joined with my good friend and co-host, as always, Colin Carlson. Today is kind of going to be a one-off episode talking about an article that Tim Stratton wrote about a week ago. It's entitled "The Argument Supporting the Incompatibility Thesis," but really all it is another objection to determinism. And if you're familiar with his work, this is kind of all he does. It feels like most of his work is just how can I argue against determinism and prove it wrong. So Colton thought it'd be a good idea to look at this article and go through it because it touches on a lot of things that we hear a lot from the other side, objections against determinism. So be helpful to go through it and talk about those things. I'm going to have the link for it in the description of this video. Also, as you can see, have it up on the right side of the screen and hopefully big enough for you guys to see it, so you can follow along as we go through. With that, Colton, let's get this going.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, as
Dude,
always.
it's our show. It's not like you're a guest here. All right? Jesus.
Uh,
You always
okay,
start with some stupid joke or just something awkward.
I freaking love it. So here's what Tim Stratton wrote. So yeah, he wrote a whole book on middle knowledge, and we just got done explaining middle knowledge as one of the models of providence in the last episode. After this episode 6, what we're going to do is go back to the models of providence and talk about objections. But I'd like to just take I don't know, a brief interlude and just talk about the incompatibility thesis. Tim Stratton, if you follow me on theological debates, the ones that Shmez and I are on Facebook, he's pretty popular. He's a popular internet non-Calvinist, internet Molinist. He's obviously published. He has a doctorate, but I think his arguments are just horrible, to be honest. And this argument, though, or specifically this article, I just want to say that it's actually probably one of his best. And so, not necessarily the argument, but just his overall tone, the way he conducts himself, the way he starts with definitions that we're going to get into in a bit, what he says in the footnotes, uh, how he treats the objections with a serious attitude instead of sort of flippant with like exclamation points all over the place. I think it's just very just more mature than most of his other articles, and in that I commend him.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but as we'll see, the it's still his main defense for his arguments are still just wanting. So if you want to start, then we can go. I will probably skip down to the definitions when he starts with the definitions. So,
Okay.
uh,
Yeah, in the intro, but I mean, you could see for yourself. He doesn't say much, so it really just starts off. Um,
just yeah, he kind of introduces why this is important.
which I don't
So
care to get into. So let's just go to the definitions.
he says determinism, the idea that a specific event is necessitated by previous or prior events and or by antecedent conditions, whatever. Here's the problem. So from the very first definition, I like it, but the issue is he said specific event. The idea that a specific event is necessitated by previous events and or antecedent conditions. So that right there is just determined event. That's all that means. It doesn't necessarily mean determinism. He just described determined event. That's
Yeah.
all he described. So the ism here is not just a one specific event, it signifies in all events. And so right here, he's trying to, I think, because I know him very well, smuggle in his non-exhaustive determinism, or that idea that he likes to say. He juxtaposes it with Ed, as we're going to see in a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And right here, when he defines it like that, and he will probably respond back to me, as Peter Van Inwagen said, I'm free to define my terms. Not when previous scholars, smarter than you and I, have
Mm-hmm.
defined them differently.
Yeah.
And they own the field because they have published numerous articles, works for decades on the field. Whereas he's just published one measly book and a couple articles, and I'm definitely not published. So I'm going to rely upon them, not him. Right?
So it's
So
kind
I
of
have a
almost
problem
like
with
a sleight of hand with his definition. It's not
it.
accurate
Well,
to
yeah,
the
that's why.
conversation that's been had up to this point.
So as we described in a couple episodes ago, determinism, I would say this: it's the thesis that all events are necessitated by prior or previous causes or whatever. Causes, conditions, whatever. You don't need to use the word cause, but the thesis of determinism is just the uh, the idea that all events are necessitated by prior conditions or antecedent conditions. That
Yep.
could be divine determinism, that could be psychological determinism, physical determinism, causal determinism. I mean, it doesn't matter, right? To us, obviously, we're going to say something like theological divine determinism, but and we could perhaps use some sort of causation there, like a divine causation, which we've kind of gotten into before, but I'm not going to get into now. But that's
Hmm.
what I would say determinism is.
Yeah.
So yes, I guess he's free to, pun intended, free to define his terms that way, I
Terrible.
guess. But the issue is I have a problem with the fact that he's only saying that's one event because that literally makes determinists out of all of us. Like Kevin Tempe would hold to that definition, but obviously he doesn't believe in determinism.
Yeah.
So it's just an equivocation.
Yeah.
And so I think that's sloppy work. Next definition, exhaustive naturalistic determinism. I'm honestly not going to get into that because I don't believe in naturalism. He just throws that definition in because it's advanced by atheists, but has nothing to do with his premise, his argument in this article because he's going to talk about Ed, which is the next. So I'm just going to skip that one.
Okay.
Ed, exhaustive divine determinism. He goes to town always on this. He has many, many articles on it, why it's not redundant, why you need to have the word determinism and exhaustive on it. So he says this: the idea that God causally determines everything, everything. Notice the difference between above determinism and
Yeah.
then this, Ed, everything, one specific event. He's already setting himself up like that. Outside himself or all contingent things. So he says God causally determines all things about humanity, which would include all thoughts, beliefs, actions, behaviors, blah, 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 advanced by Calvinists. Here's the problem. I don't advance that crap. Here's why. Number one, determinism already means exhaustive.
Yeah.
He just described a determined event. And in my big, big, big reply to him that will come out next summer, I labor this point. Okay. Secondly, no, I don't believe that causal is necessary in that definition, the word cause. He says the idea that God causally determines everything outside himself. Why does he have to throw in the word causal? Causal has nothing to do with it. There's many, many Calvinists like Preciado, Bignon, Anderson, Reformed Calvinists that would agree with what Stratton calls, Ed or whatever, that God determines everything. But they don't use the word causal. So you don't need to use the word causal in order to have determinism simpliciter. You just don't.
So the
Causal,
so the
nothing to do
first
with it.
sentence says that God causally determines everything outside of himself or all contingent things. We would just say that God determines everything. We don't need that word causally in there. And
Exactly.
so what he's describing here is something that I don't think hardly anybody actually agrees with, that God causally determines everything. Um
I think it depends on how he causally determines. So
yeah,
Anderson, James and Anderson is a great Calvinist. I love him. He has a um, few books out. He teaches in North Carolina, but he's very prominent on the Calvinist scene. He agrees with the word causal. But here's the thing. He understands, even though he uses the word causal, it's not necessary. So you could be Greg Welty is another Calvinist, and he says this: you could be an industrious Calvinist, or you can be a Mysterian Calvinist. So an industrious Calvinist is like, oh, so God does determine everything, but how he does it is this way. So that's what Anderson wants to say. Anderson's like an industrious Calvinist. He wants to say, okay, God determines everything, but how does he do it? Well, he has to do it through some sort of causal mechanism. So for Anderson, he uses the word causal. And that he does mean everything, but the important part is how he causes it is what matters. Okay. And then Greg Welty, like Bignon, they would be Mysterian Calvinists. I don't know how God determines everything. All I just claim is that he does. And that's good enough, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a Mysterian Calvinist. Here's the
Well,
overall point.
okay,
It
go ahead.
doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter if you have the word causal or not. So him implanting that and then saying this is often advanced by Calvinists is just wrong. It's wrong. No, don't advance that. Take the word causal out, and then you're good. That's it.
Yeah, because I think me and you would say, like, when I've had this argument with people before and they say God causally makes everything happen, I'd be like, yeah, he's the ultimate cause of all things, but that doesn't mean he's the formal source or formal cause. Like, not all
Yep.
ideas and actions are originating with God and going outward to people. Like, you yourself can have an original thought, an idea where you are the formal source of it. You are the person causing things to happen, but that only works within the framework of God, in a sense, letting you do it or allowing it to happen. So,
Yeah.
and you could say, okay, God ultimately is causing it because he could easily shut it down, make it not happen at all, change your emotions about it. Like, something could come in. There's a million ways that could go. So ultimately, God is causing it by allowing it, but that doesn't mean it originates with him. And that's where I think that's like the heart of the argument, is the argument over how this stuff actually works. Because he says it this way in his definition.
Mhm.
15 people are going to read that and have 15 different ideas about it. And if 100 people read it, we're going to have 100 different ideas about it. Like, nobody actually knows how that works, what that looks like. Like, that's every single argument I've had on the Facebook forums. That's pretty much the heart of it, is no one knows what we're talking about.
Mhm.
So we're talking past each other constantly, and using the word causally determines is I think a big reason why, like, that it's meaningless and it's also loaded at the same
It
time.
is loaded, I would say, because when you say causally determines, what it means is God directly determines in the same way for all events. And I'm
Yeah,
saying, no, he determines all events, but not in the same way. And that's where we would get the deficient, efficient causation, stuff like that, or internal, external determination. There's different mechanisms. And since the compatibilist wholeheartedly, as we're going to see down below, wholeheartedly holds to different determining mechanisms, it cannot just be assumed that those mechanisms do not matter
yeah. It'd be like
because
saying
we obviously say that they do.
that, like, you're in a car and the car goes forward, and the car goes forward because you press the gas pedal, right? It'd be like
Mm,
saying, okay, the only way that the car goes forward is if you press the gas pedal forward. That's it. Nothing else matters. It's it. Press it forward, it goes forward. That's it. Completely ignoring the engine and all the electronics and all the mechanisms that go into actually making it go forward, like
mm,
the tires, like the cylinder, like all the extra stuff. It'd be like pretending none of that matters. None of that has anything to do with it. The only thing that matters is the pedals down. That's it.
mm.
Like, completely simplifying the conversation down to the point where it's pretty much meaningless. And anybody can argue against a simple point. Like, it takes a lot of
Mhm.
work to get into the meat of what most people mean by that. And the problem, I think, with Calvinists too is that we don't have a united front on what we actually mean when we talk about these things. So
And that's unfortunate.
it
But
is unfortunate, but that's why we're having these conversations, to try to get some type of system
yeah, and
going.
I'm not. Yeah, I'm not saying that all Calvinists should hold to, what we're holding to. What I'm saying is that they should be more informed than they are, so that you don't have someone like Tim Stratton coming here and just punching bags and then they're flying. And then other people are saying, oh, I guess Calvinists can't really come up with a good definition. Ha ha, I guess it's wrong or something like that. And I'm saying, no, that's false.
Yeah.
So let's move on to libertarian freedom. He is obviously a libertarian, so he defines it this way. And I don't really have any problem with this, but I have some mild critiques. But it's since he's a libertarian, he obviously can define it however he wants. He's the libertarian. But he says it's two parts. Number one, referring to an agent's choice, action, evaluation, judgment is not causally determined by someone else or something else. Number two, the opportunity to exercise an ability to choose among a range of options, each of which is compatible with one's nature and or circumstances, where those antecedent previous conditions are insufficient to causally determine or necessitate one's choice. So obviously, as we described previously in other podcast episodes, wholeness, like Stratton, Arminians, and open theists usually hold to something like libertarian freedom. They define it a little bit differently, but at its core, libertarianism is really just the conjunction of two propositions: incompatibilism and free will. And so, how you define that free will is really the tricky part, and that's where a lot of libertarians kind of butt heads. They all agree that there's free will. It's just how do you have free will? Tim Stratton says this: number one, you have to be the source. So that's the number one that he says there, referring to an agent's choice that's not causally determined. So, in other words, your choice is the ultimate choice.
Yep.
So it has to be up to you. So that's what we call sourcehood in freedom literature. The second part, he actually calls an opportunity to exercise an ability. That ability is what we call leeway. So there's usually two ways that you can get freedom. It's source freedom and leeway freedom. So leeway is like kind of like elbow room, like I can do this, kind of like alternative possibilities. So he, number one, libertarian freedom is the source, and also it needs to be the ability. And I would say, yes, that's absolutely correct. Good job. You need those two things in order to be free. Both are necessary. Good job, Stratton. Now, he does say opportunity to exercise an ability. Opportunity there to me is just, he can't get around it. He also says it in his book, but it has to be a categorical opportunity. What that means is everything inside and of yourself and outside yourself, nothing determines you to do what you do. So, in other words, if I roll back the clock, I could do this one time. If I roll it back again, I could do something completely different given the same circumstances.
Yep.
Does that make sense? So
Yep.
it's kind of like a garden of forking paths. So that's the leeway condition. He doesn't use the word categorical, but I think that's the best word to describe it, and he uses it in his book, so I'm okay. Now, he does give a footnote, which I will disagree with this footnote. He says another way to describe libertarian freedom, it's all the way at the bottom, but
Hold on,
is the
let me
ability to.
find it. Hold on. Okay. So you said down in the notes at number one, I got it pulled up here now.
Yeah, so he says this could be a different definition of libertarian freedom. He says libertarian freedom is the ability to choose such that antecedent conditions are insufficient to causally determine one's choice. And then he says this definition of libertarian freedom holds whether or not there are alternative possibilities. Here's the problem. It actually does not. I can't think of a single libertarian that would say that. A single professional PhD libertarian philosopher that would say that. Van Inwagen, Tempe, Paraboom, he's not a libertarian, but he's an incompatibilist. O'Connor, Shabu, I could go on and on. Kane, these are all professional. If you're in the, I know you don't know who any of them are, but if you're in the literature and if you're reading and you look at like how they respond to each other, none of them say this. You know what he just described in that footnote?
Hmm.
All he described was source incompatibilism. He did not describe libertarianism. So source incompatibilism is a more modest incompatibilist view. So libertarianism, by definition, is an incompatibilist view. In other words, you cannot be free and determined at the same time. That's what that means. Okay? So source incompatibilism is a more modest version of libertarianism, saying that what's not really important about free will is the alternative possibilities condition. What's really important about the alternate about free will is that you are the source. In other words, nothing outside of you causally determines what you do. This is exactly what Stratton says in this footnote. So what he just described was source incompatibilism. At best, he describes something like in the literature called virtue libertarianism, but still, even given those two views, if you know the literature, you would know that alternative possibilities are still necessary, at least in some time slice of the agent's causal history. So, in other words, the agent, sometime in her life, still needed alternative possibilities, robust, significant alternative possibilities. That's still necessary. Now, they may not have alternative possibilities at some other time in their life, like later on. I don't want to go too deep into that, but that's the general idea. They may have to have it. They have to have it at some point earlier in their life, but they don't necessarily need to have it at some later point in their life. Okay, what he described right here in this footnote is that he seems to say that you don't need them at all. And that's the issue. Now, he doesn't necessarily get too deep into that, and so I'm not going to press it too much because maybe he's just writing fast, and so I want to be charitable here. But he seems to imply that you don't really need it at all, that you really all you need is sourcehood and not the leeway condition or the alternative possibilities condition. And I'm saying that does not work. No libertarian would say that. No libertarian would say that. You need to have the alternative possibilities condition. I hope that makes a little bit more sense.
Sure.
I will move on because the other definitions are super simple,
Yeah.
easy. So he says compatibilism, the thesis that free will and or moral responsibility and rational responsibility of thinking, right, not just doing stuff, is compatible with determinism. I would agree.
Mm-hmm.
He does give another footnote here, which I'm going to restrain myself. He says that it doesn't necessarily need to describe reality all the time. You don't need to scroll down there or anything, but he says it doesn't need to describe reality at all the time. No, it does. And so I will wait to show why I think it does when I release my big reply to him. And I
Dun
think
dun dun.
I think it does, and I spend many, 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 many pages with diagrams to show why
Ooh,
that's the
fancy.
case.
Very cool.
So I'll move on. Incompatibilism with the thesis that freedom and/or rational moral responsibility is not compatible with determinism. Now he says in a desert sense. That does not mean desert there. It means desert, so like deserving of praise or blame. He always says this like it needs to be in a desert sense. There's no other sense, Tim Stratton, in which compatibilists are interested in. It's so dumb. Like, I'm sorry, that may sound like an ad hominem, but I really do want to say it is actually kind of dumb. Because if you know the literature well enough, there's no other sense in which the compatibilist cares about. No other sense. And since your argument is against compatibilism, you need to assume that the sense that in which they care about is the most important. We care about whether or not you can be praised or blamed and yet at the same time be determined. Obviously, you and me, Shemez, we would say, yes, of course. God can determine everything about you in different ways, of course, but nonetheless, you don't have alternatives, and yet you are still praised or blamed for what you do.
Yeah.
That's the compatibilist thesis, but that's the only sense in which we care about. So he keeps saying like, in a desert sense. That's great, but I don't see why that matters, especially when you're arguing against compatibilism.
There's a lot of that
Um,
throughout his
I know.
arguments.
I'm not going to bring it up anymore, but that's just the thing.
Yeah.
And he goes on this whole trail with Yan Bing Yan, which I love. He's like my favorite. I'm dedicating my Stratton reply to him because he's amazing. And then he goes on why like his main aim in the book, his book Human Freedom, Divine Knowledge, and Mere Monism. He goes more into this, does not describe reality, or compatibilism cannot actually describe, always describe the way things are. Like I said, I will leave it to my reply. I don't want to spoil it here, so I will move on. But I will just say, I don't think that works. It cannot work. You need to have exhaustive compatibilism or exhaustive incompatibilism. Okay? So again, we'll move on. He then gives a lemma. A lemma is like a side core argument in order to, defend his overall thesis, and it's this. It says, three step argument with a conclusion, two premises conclusion. If X, so person, whatever, X is not rationally responsible, then X is not morally responsible. I agree with that. And we'll see when he defends premise one, I totally agree. What he's basically saying is, in order for you to be held morally responsible, you need to first be held rationally responsible. So moral responsibility entails rational responsibility. So it just means you need to be able to think what you're doing, think about what you're doing in order to be held morally responsible. I think that's a good premise. I have in previously I've had some back and forths with him where I try to deny that premise, but he has shown me where I don't think I can, and so I actually went back and I accept this premise now. His second premise is if Ed, exhaustive divine determinism, is true, X is not rationally responsible. And then obviously the conclusion, if Ed is true, then X is not morally responsible, which is straight up the incompatibilist thesis, and I want to deny the conclusion. So in order to deny that deductive conclusion, I need to reject one of the two premises. So I already said I accept one, so that means I have to reject two. Then he goes on, if you want to scroll down, he defends premise one. I'm not going to get into this, although I do not like this middle paragraph, the one that says determinists often appeal to something called guidance control. I'm not going to get into that here because he's just way off. I will just say this to be brief. He does not know what guidance control is. I will explain that in my reply, why he's wrong, how he's wrong, and so forth. But he does not know what guidance control is. Guidance control, by definition, is already compatible with determinism. And he wants to try to say, well, if God determines everything, that means God determines how one guides. Not in the same way, though, Tim Stratton, and you manipulated your definitions in order to already beg the question against the compatibilist. Because we say it does depend upon how God determines. And even though he is the ultimate guider, he is not directly, as you said, pressing on the gas pedal all the time.
Yeah.
That's a great analogy. He's not pressing the gas pedal at all times. So he's determining in a different way, something in which Tim Stratton doesn't ever acknowledge.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's really a heavy defeater, or at least a severe undercut for some of his objections here. Like I said, I'm not going to get into it any more than it is. He quotes some other philosophers like David Beguet or Carolina Sotario, which I love Carolina Sotario, to kind of defend this premise, and I think that's fine. But that paragraph right there with guidance control is just hogwash. He doesn't need to say that paragraph in order to defend that premise correctly. It's kind of a weird paragraph to put in the
It,
middle
it's
of
just
the
a it's just a cheap shot at guidance
yeah,
control
like
on his way to
it's
making a
really
point nobody really argues with. You know what I
exactly,
mean?
and I like you don't need that there. So if you it's I get his overall like gist, like he wants to defend premise one. You don't need that paragraph here. You could just say what Carolina Sartario says, who is a compatibilist, and that would be good enough. That would suffice. So I'm going to jump all the way down to premise two because that's the one I'm going to try to argue against and just see. And I want to show why I think his defense of premise two is ultimately not rational or If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So premise two, what is it again? If Ed is true, X is not rationally responsible. Obviously, I want to be able to say, if Ed is true, then X can be rationally responsible because I do believe he's rationally responsible and morally responsible. And so, if compatibilism is true, that's the case.
Yeah.
Okay, so he offers this quasi argument in defense of premise two. Okay, what's the argument? This sub argument is a six-step argument. He starts with premise one. He calls it the rationality argument against divine determinism, or RAD. Very clever. If God causally determines, again, we don't need the causal, but I'll allow it. If God causally determines Jack to affirm a false belief about X in the actual world, then Jack does not possess the opportunity to exercise an ability to infer a better or true belief about X in the actual world. I have problems with it, but I'll continue to the second premise just to get the full thing. Okay. If Ed is true, then God causally determines all things, or all humans, including Jack, to affirm false theological beliefs. No one's theology is fallible. Okay, that's fine. Premise three, if God causally determines all humans to affirm some false theological beliefs, then Jack stands in no epistemic position to know which of his theological affirmations are true and which of his theological affirmations are false. Four, if Jack does not stand in a position to rationally affirm his theological beliefs, then Jack possesses a defeater, a reason to doubt his theological beliefs. Five, if Jack possesses a reason to doubt his theological beliefs, then Jack cannot rationally affirm his theological beliefs. Thus, this would include rational affirmations that God causally determines all things, and that we don't possess libertarian freedom. And then finally, the conclusion. Therefore, if Ed is true, Jack cannot rationally affirm his theological beliefs. And so, what this argument shows is a pretty heavy defeater, I think, if true, for compatibilism, and hence the title. You know,
Yeah.
an argument for the incompatibility thesis. Okay, and so I think it's an okay argument. I don't think it's a good argument. It's valid, but it's not sound. Now let's go back to premise one because I'm going to really focus on premise one and three. But actually, before premise one, I just want to say premise two, fine, that's true. If Ed is true, then God does determine everything, including affirming false theological beliefs. I will add, though, he determines it in a different way than he would determine it a true theological belief in the agent. Okay, so I think that must be said. He can efficiently determine a true theological belief in an agent in some way, or he could deficiently determine a false theological belief in an agent. Okay, but it's not against the agent's will. So I just want to say that, but I would agree with that premise. Four, it's kind of four builds on, and I really wish he would have do this, but he should show how the premises relate to each other, like follows from this premise, but he doesn't. But four, I would deny three, and then that means five is denied, and six obviously is denied. So let's go back to one. If God causally determines Jack to affirm a false belief about X in the actual world, then Jack does not possess an opportunity to exercise an ability to infer a belief in the actual world. First of all, why does it have to be in the actual world? I know why he does this. Because he does it specifically against those determinists or compatibilists who want to posit something like the conditional analysis. So Bignon is one of them. And so Kane, a libertarian, Robert Kane, tries to show his disdain against this analysis, this conditional analysis, saying, you know, I could have done this instead of that if I had wanted to. So it doesn't necessarily need to be in the actual world. It's just some reference to some other world in which I could have done this if the laws of nature or God determined me differently. I would have done that instead of this. But in the actual world, as it happens, I actually did this. As long like it's this play on like the ability to do otherwise. Anyways, if the compatibilists can say there's a different analysis of ability than the analysis of ability that Stratton presses in that premise, then the premise doesn't work. And so Kane, like I said, he wants to try to say, oh, you can't press the conditional analysis because the actual world is the world that we're concerned with, not some other, possible world that the conditional analysis actually tries to access. Stratton does the same thing here. So while I appreciate his efforts, I don't see how it works because I could still posit the conditional analysis and ask, why does the actual world actually matter? Like seriously, why does it matter? What I understand what he wants to say is the actual sequence of events matters, and not necessarily the alternative sequence of events. But the alternative sequence of events still is necessary to see so that we can see what happens in the actual sequence of events. So, I, and again, if that's still kind of confusing, totally good. I'm not going to spend most of my time on premise one, but I
Yeah.
would still say, no, I don't see how it works. Secondly, even if I grant the actual world in the conditional analysis, it's his burden, right? So he needs to show some other independent argument for why the categorical ability or the categorical opportunity to exercise an ability and for a better or true belief about X, that, why that is necessary in the actual world in order to be morally responsible.
Yeah.
So even if I grant like, okay, I can't use the conditional or some sort of dispositional ability, I have to accept his categorical. So what? Why is that like why does that matter? Right? And I've been back and forth in personal correspondence with Stratton in the same way with this over and over and over again. And I think you've read some of them, the personal correspondence between him and me. He never gives me that independent argument. He needs to show me why the categorical, that metaphysical ability, the garden of forking paths, why that kind of garden of forking paths is indeed necessary for responsibility in the first place.
Yeah.
Like he doesn't give me that. And so since he doesn't give me that, why should I accept the premise one? He just doesn't. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say with premise one. I don't
Well,
think he has adequately defended that premise as much as possible, as much as he could.
yeah. My thing when I first read the first premise, you had a million things to say about it that I would have never even considered. All I see is that if God causally determines, like right there, I'm like, if God actually did that the way you're describing, maybe, but I don't believe God works like that. I don't believe God causally determines, like makes people believe that, forces people to believe that. I don't think that. So I have an issue with that phrase right off the bat. And then
Mhm.
affirm a false belief. What do you mean by affirm? Like pat you on the back? Yes, like this is my stamp of approval on your false belief because I'm determining it. I'm like putting the idea in your mind is basically what
Mhm.
he's saying. I'm like, okay, that doesn't work either. Like if God determines
We don't believe that,
to
yeah.
allow Jack to believe in or it would be if God determines Jack to believe in a false, yeah, to have a false belief. It just be allows him to have a false belief, like does nothing. That like literally in my mind, God is not influencing Jack whatsoever. Jack of his own volition and of his own sin nature is going to hold false beliefs.
Hmm.
And that's how I would say that that actually happens. So like the premise right off the bat is like I don't know
It
what he's
assumes there's
talking
only
about.
one mechanism in which God can determine
Yeah.
evil. I would say having a false belief, in a sense, is not perfect. It's not righteous, right? Like we and some even though we don't epistemically have all the knowledge for us, it's not as good as it could be, right? And so, especially when you affirm, like, you're willing to die on this hill, I think that's what he means by affirm. I would say that's not good. Okay, so does God determine not good things the same way he would determine a good thing? And we would say no.
Yeah,
And
100%
so
different.
that's, and I'm glad you brought that up because that's another reason why I would reject the premise.
Yeah, so
Uh,
it's like if God allows Jack to continue to hold a false belief about X, Jack doesn't possess the opportunity to exercise an ability to infer a better or true belief about X. I would say like if he wrote it that way, that's true. Because people on their own, left to their own devices, outside of any influence from God, Holy Spirit, the Word of God, whatever
mhm.
you want to call it, outside of any influence from that, they will continue to hold false beliefs. Or they'll go from one false belief to another, to another, to another, but it's always going to
Yeah.
be incorrect in some way, shape, or form. So the only way Jack could get to some type of true belief about the world is if God, I would then say, causally determines Jack to affirm a true belief about X. That's the only way that could
However,
happen.
yeah. However he does that is up to God, but it has to be a way in which it doesn't eradicate his agency. It has to go through the agency of Jack. That's what a compatibilist would say.
Yeah.
That just means that the determining mechanism is different than what Stratton may. It's not quite explicit here in what kind of mechanisms he's thinking, but I'm with you. I think we know Stratton well enough that he does mean gas pedal full fledged. Down on the gas pedal, you're determining directly. And we would just say he doesn't. A great, and he loves this philosopher as much as I do. Guillaume Bignon has a great essay in Calvinism and Middle Knowledge, a conversation. It's at towards the end. I think he's like the second to last essay. It's cleverly titled. It means the title is called "Lord Willing, God Forbid," a Calvinist assessment on divine permission. So I know, and I'm just going to say this. I'm going to cover your tracks because I love you. A lot of people may listen to this and be like, well, Shemez said God allows. There's no allowance in determinism. God determines. How can there be any allowance
I'm just
allowing
saying,
things?
like, that would be
Yeah,
for us. When I say allows, I mean he what's the terminology we use? He
efficiently.
deficiently causes by
I
doing
agree.
nothing.
And
That's
so,
what I mean by that word.
yeah, and I think being if I'm just saying in general, if a reader's like, that doesn't make sense, go read this. Calvinism in Middle Knowledge, a conversation, the book, edited by John Lang and Greg Welty. Second to last essay from Guillaume Bignon, Lord willing, God forbid. He cleverly and expertly shows how a Calvinist actually hold to divine permission language. In other words, how a determinist Calvinist can actually say God allows.
Yeah.
It's
Like it
beautiful. It's
there I guess
beautiful.
there's a
And
really
uses the
complicated
same stuff that we do.
a really complicated analysis and explanation as to why I feel perfectly fine saying those words, but for somebody who doesn't know or is coming in here like with a certain mindset of trying to disprove us,
Mhm.
they're gonna jump all over that. Like I agree with you there. But at the same time, it's like I'm just trying to make this conversation go smoother and a lot quicker without
Fun.
explaining definitions constantly. But I was thinking of that first point. If we want to use the car gas pedal analogy, in my mind, it's like the car is at the top of a hill and it's rolling down the hill. And even if you do nothing at all, the driver just completely doesn't do anything, it's going to roll down the hill and like crash into a
No matter
wall.
what.
No matter what. If the driver does nothing, then the car is just going to do that. Like just the rules of nature, the way things are, the car has no hope. So the only way it stops is if somebody presses on the brakes and like
Hmm.
turns the car around and accelerates up the hill.
Hmm.
I would say that's what God is causally determining, we'll say Jack in this instance, to do. So
Hmm.
if God does nothing and allows the false belief, that car is just going to go down the hill, smash into the wall. So if God,
With certainty.
with certainty, 100,000%, all men sin fall short of the glory of God, and crash into a wall if nothing happens. But if the premise was if God causally determines Jack to affirm a true belief about the world, then Jack now possesses the opportunity to exercise the ability to infer a better or true belief about X. That I would agree with. But to say God causally determines and affirms false beliefs, I don't think you'll find
Mhm.
a soul like in Christianity that would be like, yeah, I believe that. No one
Maybe if you're
believes
like
that.
a hyper Calvinist,
Like
but
some
we're not.
weirdo person, maybe, but
Yeah.
it's like you're arguing against like three people at that point. You're not arguing against the bulk of Calvinism. So right off the bat,
So,
we're like not we're again talking past each other. We're not even on the same page off the jump. So
yeah.
not a good
But
look for the rest of the argument.
I will say though, I like how he phrased the premise. I think he's using a lot of different vocabulary from other authors like Robert Kane. He got this idea of opportunity from another libertarian, Christopher Franklin. And so I like how he's trying to utilize the literature as much as possible, but he's not necessarily utilizing it to the best of his ability. So
Well,
even
he
if I grant premise one, I think there's other flaws with the argument,
he's showing
which
even
we'll
in
get.
premise one that he doesn't understand the bulk
At
of
least the
what we're
yeah,
actually saying.
he doesn't understand the compatibilist literature. He may understand the libertarian literature.
Yeah, and
And for
that's
that, I'm like, okay, that's fine. You're a libertarian, you should.
but it's the same way these conversations always go. It's the side of the compatibilist is getting misrepresented,
Because
like
he's
always.
he's doing an internal critique here, which means he's doing a reductio ad absurdum. Because the conclusion is, if I assume your worldview, Ed, if that's true, this is what logically follows. That sucks, so therefore Ed is false. That's the reductio. He has to assume the premises of the opposite party, us, in order for the reductio to work. Otherwise, why would I believe a premise that you have if I'm already going to reject it? Right? So, in other words, it's just going to be question begging. So, if you say, "Oh, this is a good premise to put in. This is what the compatibilist believes," and then you go all the way down the steps, and then you conclude with the conclusion that you want, I'm just going to say it's question begging. Why does that matter? And I think what you pinpointed there, that God causally determines Jack, well, he doesn't causally determine Jack in all different ways, and he needs to be able to give us that before I can accept the premise. But let's just say he does give us that, and let's just say he somehow crafts it in his argument. For the sake of argument, I'm just going to accept premise one. Where
Sure.
would I put a lot of my stake in? I would put most of my stake in premise three. In other words, I would reject premise three wholeheartedly. Let's read it and I'll show you exactly why. So, if God causally determines all humans to affirm some false theological beliefs, here's what he thinks logically follows. And Jack stands in no epistemic position to know which of his theological affirmations are true and which of his theological affirmations are false. Absolutely reject this. Absolutely reject this. And it's going to be funny because the way I reject it, the reason why I reject it is he's going to bring up on that footnote. So
I'm
footnote
looking at it.
12. Yeah, so scroll down because that one prominent internet Calvinist that he's talking about, that's
Thank
me.
you. Yeah, I figured.
I remember getting in this conversation with him, and I brought up the same thing that he's quoting me on, or I think he's paraphrasing me or whatever. I'm pretty sure he's paraphrasing me. And he thinks that it misses the point, and then he goes along why he thinks it misses the point. So I'm going to try to show why his defense of my defense against that premise is actually false. So here's how I would describe it, and then I'm going to go to Stratton. I say, why would I deny premise three? Why would I say that it doesn't follow that Jack has no epistemic awareness? Because what that assumes is that Jack has no internal or external awareness. Or let's just even give him more room. it assumes that Jack has no internal awareness, no internal epistemic awareness to know which of his theological affirmations are true and which ones are false. In other words, it already describes and already tries to entail that God cannot determine in a certain way. Okay? So, in other words, it already entails the fact or assumes that God can only determine externally. And so, I know him, and he says in his book that the only way that you can well, I shouldn't say only way, but one of the biggest ways that you can have knowledge, at least knowledge worth wanting, rationally affirmed and rationally inferred knowledge, is through justified true belief. That's an old from Socrates, very old definition of knowledge. Knowledge is justified true belief. How you accrue that kind of knowledge is through an internal awareness. Okay, so basically being internally aware of the reasons why you affirm something. I'm not going to get into all the details of that because that's hardcore philosophy. But that's the general idea. There's an internal awareness and an external awareness. And so you can be justified by knowing something externally and internally. And he's trying to say, if I understand the premise, that Jack stands in no internal awareness if determinism is true. Now, I'm saying that's false because God can determine internally in the agent. And obviously, if God determines internally through the agent, then the agent does have reasons for why he affirms theological beliefs and why he doesn't. And if that is all that's necessary for someone to be justified in their knowledge, then Jack does have epistemic position to know which one of his theological affirmations are true and false. And therefore, the premise is rejected. Does that make sense? And so when he goes down to 12, he tries to argue against it. But I want to stop here and see if it makes sense before I actually
Yeah.
go
I'm
through
trying to
what he wants to
I'm trying to put
respond.
my head around it. So you're saying that if God does determine somebody to have internal thoughts,
Internal awareness.
internal awareness,
Hmm.
then
It can stand in an epistemic position to know which beliefs are true and false.
do you think God just
Why?
at a base value allows everybody to have internal awareness?
All the internal awareness means is that you know why you believe what you believe. You know why things are false and why things are true, even if it's flippantly, even if it's like through immediate justification. So so you have the reasons available to you mentally. You have them accessible to you. So you can say, "Oh, I believe the sky is blue because of this," or "I believe God exists because of this." So you have a general working framework, even if it's not as detailed as a philosopher would have it, a general working framework for why you think things are the way things are.
So you would say Jack does have an epistemic position to know which one of his theological affirmations are true because he's
Yes.
aware,
Yes.
and he's only aware because God determined him to be aware.
Yep. To me, that doesn't matter. All
Yeah,
that's
to me that
so
doesn't matter either.
What Stratton wants to say is you can't be just his overarching, and you'll see this in his book. His overarching thesis is you can't be justified in your rationality. Why? Because you don't have alternatives to evaluate and judge different options, what is true and false. Okay, and since you don't have those, given ed, you can't be rationally responsible for what you do. In other words, in order to be justified in your knowledge, you have to have alternatives available to you. Okay? In order to rationally infer or affirm knowledge claims, you have to have alternatives, categorical, garden of forking paths, alternatives available to the agent in order to stand in an epistemic position to know which theological beliefs are false and which ones are true. So in other words, he's saying this: you need to have libertarian freedom in order to be rational. That is question begging. It's question. So he's saying the internal awareness that you must have needs to be an awareness such that you have alternatives available to you. And I'm saying, why? When all that's necessary in order for you to be in order for you to be justified in your knowledge is internal awareness, not internal awareness such that you have alternatives, that doesn't follow. All that's necessary for you to be justified in your knowledge is that you have internal awareness. That is it. No other competing metaphysical beliefs, such as the categorical alternative possibilities, is necessary for you to be justified in your knowledge. So he's saying, though, that those alternatives are necessary for you to be justified in your knowledge. And I'm saying that doesn't follow. Show me an independent reason for why that's the case. That's what I should find. Guess what I don't find in this article? That. You feeling me?
Yeah. Well, I don't.
It's
There's a lot of places I could go, but I'll just go with what I see as a very uneducated person reading this. If I would say, if God allows humans to have some false beliefs, then Jack doesn't stands in no epistemic position to know which one of his theological beliefs are true and which ones are false. And I would say that pretty much describes almost everybody. Nobody can really
mm,
know for sure with 100% certainty that all of their theological affirmations are true and which ones that they hold currently are false. Like I would say that there's certain things you're a Christian that you would wholeheartedly stand with 100%. Jesus died on a cross for my sins.
mm,
Like there's some things that you cannot waver on, that you have to
mm,
believe with all your heart is true. And I would say that most of those affirmations would be true. Um, but to say that everything you believe is true, nobody's there, and nobody's in a position to actually know which is true and which is false. We're all just giving our best guess. So in my mind, I'm like everybody's kind of in that position where we don't exactly
mm,
know. Um, and that's you don't need to blame God for that. Like God allows us to sometimes hold false beliefs because we're gonna learn, we're gonna mature, and sometimes that takes going through things in your life, like at a physical sense, to get you to understand something spiritually. And that to him probably might be more valuable than just inputting it in your head. You know what I mean? Like a
mm.
DLC upgrade or something. Like you have to earn it in a sense. And I'm not saying that happens with everything, but I was just reading that and I'm just like, so the flip side of it would be you if you don't hold this, you stand in a position to know which one of your affirmations are true and which ones are false, and you're an accurate
Like,
judge
yeah,
of that. That doesn't sound right.
yeah, that's a whole nother issue. It's he doesn't ever deal with the problem of luck at all. He just takes for granted that given libertarian freedom, that oh, I can actually choose or I can actually affirm which ones are false and which ones are true because I have evaluative judgment options. I'm just saying, to me, it just runs straight up into the problem of luck, which he doesn't deal with. I'm not going to get into, but yeah, you're right. It doesn't seem right to me at all. I'm not going to get into it because he doesn't bring it up. But all I'm saying is he hasn't shown why the metaphysical tag on to what's necessary for justified knowledge is in fact necessary. So he wants to say that that metaphysical tag on along with the internal awareness is what's necessary in order for Jack to have epistemic
So
positioning of which one
so
of his
so
beliefs are true and false.
maybe my like where I catch up with you on this argument is once it gets to number 4. If Jack does not stand in a position to rationally affirm his theological beliefs, anybody can rationally affirm their beliefs. I would venture to say that unless you like have some mental issue or something, everybody has a rational, to their own understanding, a rational affirmation to why they believe what they believe.
Yeah,
Even if God causally determines it in a sense to have a true belief, like I would say that's how I got saved. For whatever reason, God caused me to understand something that I would have never came to understand on my own. That doesn't mean that I have no rationale for it.
yeah,
But
exactly.
I
And
have my reasons, and like you said, I'm aware of my reasons, and I have mentally and philosophically and spiritually waded through my other options, and I came to a certain conclusion based on my own rationale that could be some of it causally determined by God, some of it is irrational because I'm sinful, and I
mhm.
would say I'm in no epistemic position to know 100% with 100% certainty which are true and which are false. Um, that's why I think it's called faith, because you need to,
I
a little bit
think
under
I think what
go
I
out
think
on
you're
a limb on
saying.
some things.
I think this is just total side comment. I think you're totally willing to take a hardline response and just accept that in some sense. Kind of accept the premise in some case, in some sense that yeah, you're right. I don't have epistemic position to know.
Yeah,
At least, like I said, in some sense, to me, I'm taking much more of a soft line response. Um, but I think both work in some in if you can tease out what you're trying to say, maybe not now, but later, like in a different episode, I think it would work. But, I mean, all we're saying is that I don't think the premise works on multiple levels, and I think you would agree with that.
yeah. I
Uh,
would I would say, like, I mean, we already talked about one and two, but for three, I would agree if he took out if he said it like this: if God determines all humans to have some false theological beliefs, then Jack stands in no epistemic position to know which ones are true and which ones are false. I would agree with that statement. If you take out causally and if you take out affirm, because my same problem with the first one is God is not causally making people have false beliefs or to affirm false beliefs. That's completely wrong premise to start with. But if he allows people to have false beliefs of their own volition, then yeah, we don't stand in any position to know which ones are true and which ones are false. And then for premise four, I would say if Jack does not stand in position to rationally affirm his theological beliefs, right there I'm like, wait. How does three get to four? He can't wade through which ones are true and which ones are false, but he has definitely thought about these things in a rational manner.
mm,
And if you're leaving Jack to himself, he has reasons to affirm his theological beliefs. But then it goes on. Then Jack possesses a defeater against his theological beliefs, or a reason to doubt his theological beliefs. I think everybody has a reason to doubt them to an extent. So
yeah, I think it's just he's if we assume his worldview, I think that's what you're saying. We assume the other way, libertarian freedom, it gives a shocking amount of certainty in your affirmations that it's kind of like empirically odd, sort of radical. Like no one would have that much certainty in their affirmations if that was the case.
like
I
no
don't know.
nobody could actually um be confident in their own affirmations if we believe that God was determining it. I would say that that's kind of the nature of human beings in general, is that it's hard to be confident in any sort of theological belief.
Mm.
And I would say that the only reason I am is because of the Holy Spirit, and the people that hold to like wild theological beliefs, it could be because mentally they had to make up some reason to justify the actions that they've done. or it's just all they've known, it's the culture they grew up in. I mean, there's a million ways you could take that conversation to reasons why people have false beliefs. But I would say the only reason you would have a true belief is the Holy Spirit. So I don't
Here's
know.
what I want to do. I want to continue with the footnote 12. So
Okay.
he tries to defend against my basic idea of you don't need alternatives in order to be rationally justified knowledge. You just need internal awareness. So he tries to paraphrase it and then show why it doesn't work. So I'm just going to read what he says in footnote 12. That's
Yeah.
important because if his defense against my defense works, then I have nothing, and then the argument can go through,
You
even if we
can
grant one.
read it and keep going. I'll be right back. Just keep talking to the audience. Sorry.
So here's what he says. Response to me to refute the third premise. He says, but if I have internal awareness and can think of and about competing beliefs, perhaps I could have justified knowledge and epistemic access. Stratton says that this is irrelevant and misses the point. He says if a deity of deception causally determines all people, including me, to affirm false beliefs, then me, Ed Calvinist, cannot stand in no position to internally evaluate which of their beliefs is true or false and which one. First of all, how does that follow? Where is that independent premise, Stratton? What you are confusing is the determining mechanism with the determiner. So, yes, the determiner is external to me. The determiner is external to me. Sure, that's true. God is external to me. That follows, obviously. I'm an Ed Calvinist, as you would say. But what doesn't follow is that the determining mechanism is actually different. Or that the determining mechanism, uh, what am I trying to say? That the determining mechanism is the problem. So there's a difference between the determining mechanism and the determiner. So yes, the determiner is external, but that doesn't mean that the external determiner, God, cannot determine in an internal way, in a way that does not undermine my agency and responsibility. Because after all, I would say if he does that, then he is, in fact, the author of sin. He would be manipulating me. But he has to determine in such a way in which my inner telos, my actual will, is intact and my agency is intact without without manipulating or circumventing the locus of my personality. So, in other words, he says this: if a deity of deception, which is a loaded thing because you need to prove that it's a deity of
I
deception.
hate every time he says that. It's like, why?
Yeah, it's
Like,
so dumb. He needs to prove that.
I don't
But
worship
anyway,
Satan like Jesus. Like, what are you getting that from? I don't know. It's just so annoying every time.
even if I grant it, a deity of deception causally determines all people, to affirm a false belief, then Ed Calvinists stand in no position. They stand in no external position, but we can stand in no, in an internal position. Then he says to internally evaluate. Yes, we internally evaluate. Because we internally evaluate, we stand in an internal position. And that's something that he doesn't address, and that's something that he doesn't actually go after. So, in short, that footnote right here, when he's responding to me saying that I only need internal awareness to be rationally justified, that right there, that footnote, is actually a straw man because he misses the point. And then he puts in a loaded statement like the deity of deception along with a loaded question without proving it. What's the independent reason for why I stand in no epistemic position? He says, well, their internal evaluative process would also be causally determined. And I would say, not in the same way, right? Not in the same way. So, in short, here's what he wants to say. He wants to say, unless you are actually the causal source, the ultimate source for your actions, you cannot be actually rationally responsible. And I think
Well,
that's a bunch of hogwash.
well,
Why?
you think
Because
of it
he
on the
hasn't proven that at
on the
all.
flip side, and this is where I think the whole argument falls to pieces for him. If I were to assume that he's 100% correct, like if I agreed with it, then that would mean, Stratton, do you honestly think that I believe that I have no autonomy, that all of my inner thoughts and actions are caused by God? Do you think that is a position I hold? Do you think I'm willing to give up all of my agency,
I would
all of
say
my
yes.
autonomy, all of like everything that I do is just a direct correlation of God causing me to do that? Literally
I
give
know.
up my humanity and admit to you that all I am is a robot acting out actions dictated by my master. Is that what you think I believe? Because that's what you're saying I believe, and that's what you're arguing against.
Okay, he thinks that that's what our beliefs entail and that we just somehow don't see it. And I'm
Like
saying they don't entail that because you got the first premise wrong. That's not even what we
exactly.
believe.
Exactly. That's why I'd be like, dude, it would be asinine for anybody to hold something like that. And you hear the way I talk about things, and we've had conversations. Like, do you think that that is like what I think is going on internally in my own head? That I am just an arbiter
Well,
of God's actions, and they're just flowing through me flawlessly. Like, come on, dude. Like, we all know
this
we're
is what
tripping and falling and trying to figure these things out. Like, and we're all making guesses. So if I believed what you're saying I believed, I wouldn't be saying things like that. I'd be
yeah.
saying I'm 100% correct, and the only reason you don't believe what I believe is because God has not opened your eyes to believe what I'm believing. Like, and in a sense, I might believe that to an extent, but I'm also not in an epistemic position to 100% think that what I think is correct, because I think that I leave reason for doubt, and I would think that you do too, to say that this might not be true. But at the same point, it's like you're arguing against something that I'm not. Like
Mm.
it's so frustrating, and I think it like paints us in such a horrible light, and then he's arguing against a caricature and not an actual belief system. And that
I wanna draw it completely home. I want to quote actual philosophers, some of which are incompatibilists. So he's on Stratton's side of the camp, showing that Stratton has no idea what he's talking about in this case. Are you ready?
sure.
It'd be great. So here's a philosopher. His name is Adam Feltz, and I'm getting this from his essay on folk intuitions. So this idea of which is more intuitive, free will or determinism, from the Rutledge Companion of Free Will. He says this, okay? Determinism should be distinguished from bypassing. Bypassing occurs when one's mental states do not play a role in the production of the action. One can think free will and moral responsibility to be compatible with determinism, like us, while thinking that they are incompatible with bypassing, like you just said. Determinism does not entail that an agent's mental states are bypassed or irrelevant to the production of the action. The distinction could explain why participants judge people not to be morally responsible for their actions in the abstract condition. That is beautiful. And it's exactly what we want to say, that
Yeah.
just because God determines, he doesn't determine by circumventing our agency. We play a role. What is that role? Our internal awareness to the reasons to epistemically know whether or not we are justified in knowing what we know.
Yeah. So I would say like I'm a determinist, but I don't believe that God bypasses my agency to determine
Exactly.
things.
Exactly.
So
Here's another quote.
go ahead.
Sorry. Go ahead. I was just going to say, here's another quote. She is a compatibilist, though. uh, Lynn Rudder Baker. Unlike the libertarian, the compatibilist does not think that external causes, such as God, of it, even if we accept the word cause here, just saying we don't have to, but let's just grant it, external causes of decisions or actions per se threaten moral responsibility. Moral responsibility is precluded only by certain kinds of external causes, those that bypass the agent's own psychological contribution involving his first person perspective. Again, We agree because that's what it doesn't need to be this idea of external determination circumventing my own internal awareness of the reasons. I'm going to continue because I really want to drill this home. So Stratton has a lot of homework to do. Are you okay with that?
Go ahead.
I have a lot more quotes. John Martin Fisher, probably one of the most well-known. I would I'd probably venture to say he's probably the number one contemporary compatibilist of today. He says this in an introductory work on free will, by the way, Four Views of Free Will, pages 52 to 53. And I know Stratton has the book, so he can look it up. He says this: not all causal sequences are created equal. More specifically, the compatibilist wishes to insist that not all causally deterministic sequences undermine freedom. A straightforward and upfront commitment to the compatibilist is to the idea that we can distinguish among causally deterministic sequences. More specifically, we can distinguish those that involve compulsion or bypass or some undermining responsibility factor. From those, we can distinguish between those from those that do not. Some like determining internally through us. That is a basic commitment to the compatibilist, that not all causally deterministic sequences undermine freedom. And I'm saying, exactly. So even if the compatibilist grants causation, we can still maintain the fact that not all causally deterministic sequences undermine freedom. And here's what Stratton must give. He must give an answer as to why determinism is supposedly understood in some special way, understood in a way that definitionally undermines freedom without begging the question against compatibilists. Good luck. Right? He needs to understand that we hold to different determining sequences. And that is what's important. Okay? And to me, if he doesn't understand that, that is a problem. I
Yeah.
want to do one more from someone he quoted in the article, Sotario, Carolina Sotario. Okay? And this is a great, I'm going to do two sets, one paragraph, and I'm going to give an argument just to drill it home. I'm going to steel man his argument here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually show why that Steelman argument, if Stratton did give it, falls. If it falls, there's absolutely no way where I can see he can salvage that premise 3. And if that falls, the argument falls. Right? Compatibilism is vindicated. So here's the quote from Sartario from her book, Causation and Free Will, pages 152 to 151 to 152. It says this. Stay with me. Challenge to our freedom, I claimed, Sartario, is not posed by determinism on its own, but by a combination of two main assumptions. The first of these assumptions is determinism, or something close to it. But the second main assumption is that we are causally impotent. So, like, basically, we can't do otherwise. Causally impotent towards some of the deterministic causes of our actions. So the problem only arises if we assume that our acts are the inevitable consequence of events that are beyond our causal reach. But this suggests that the very formulation of the problems of determinism and free will guarantees that source incompatibilism won't be satisfied. In other words, it literally assumes from the beginning that determinism is the problem because of the very definition of determinism. Obviously, determinism means that certain things are outside of our causal reach. We don't have the garden of forking paths, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can only do one at some time, any given option. One option. So that means if I am only determined to do A, B, C, D, F, G, H, K are all causally outside of my reach, right? I'm causally impotent towards that. But if you first assume determinism and say, oh, well, of course you can't do B, C, D, H, K, X, whatever. Because you can't do those, you stand in no epistemic position to to rationally affirm or infer your theological false or true beliefs. Therefore, Ed is false. You know what he just did there? He just assumed that by definition, because determinism is determinism, I cannot actually stand in an epistemic position. And he just shoved that through his premise without any such argument, any independent argument.
Yeah.
So, in other words, we call that in philosophy, we call that question begging. Okay? Here's the steel man that I'm going to give. It's Carolina's steel man here. This idea of the ultimacy condition. So I need to be basically, so in order to have epistemic awareness or epistemic position, like Stratton wants to say that basically I can't be determined. Here's the argument Carolina gives. Premise one, if our choices are determined by factors outside our causal reach via an external mechanism or external determiner, which is what Stratton wants to say, we don't ever have causal access to all of the actual sufficient causes or sources of our choices. That's true. That's what determinism means. Premise two, we cannot be free unless we have causal access to all the actual sufficient choices or sufficient sources of our choices. So if I'm not the sufficient source of my choice, then I cannot be free. That's what premise 2 says. Conclusion, if our choices are determined by factors outside our causal reach, we cannot be free. Here's what I say. Premise 1 obviously is determinism. We obviously do not have efficient causal access. Okay? We just don't. That's what determinism means. But I would reject premise 2. Why? Because premise 2 just simply assumes what it's trying to prove. The question at hand is whether efficient causal access is a necessary condition for rational, desert, agential responsibility, like what Stratton wants to argue. That's what the question is. Whether that is necessary. In order to prove that it is, it must first be assumed. If it is assumed, then it renders the argument as unsound because it's just circular, it's question begging. So the incompatibilist here needs to prove the claim that being determined by factors outside one's causal reach is incompatible with being free. That's what Stratton needs to prove. But that is literally just premise 2 of Carolina's argument. So you see what Stratton's doing here? He's implicitly smuggling in his incompatibilist bias and saying that we can't have epistemic position because even if God determines internally, we just can't have that, we just can't be rational. And I'm saying, why not?
Yeah.
He doesn't tell us.
So if we rephrase the question saying that like Jack stands in no epistemic position to consider choices A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and let's just get rid of the theological affirmations and just stick with choices. Then you follow his argument down the list and you get to the very bottom where it says, then humans don't possess the power or opportunity to exercise the ability to rationally infer between choices. So we've been saying all along, just because maybe we only have access to one choice, does that mean that we don't rationally infer or consider all of the other choices because we believe we only have access to one? Like it being the ability to reason and think about something does not mean that I have to accept it and believe it. That you want to take that to this conversation is I can think about and reason with a theological position without accepting it. Like and just because I believe I'm determined to accept a certain position, which I would even say I don't know if this is the end all be all position to where I'm determined in my lifetime to end up. I would say it's determined by God that I believe this right now. And it's a step in the process of getting me to where he wants me to be eventually. Maybe I could completely flip on what I think right now. I'd say that this conversation has to happen within a point in time. If you want to say in a theological way, but if it's just access to different choices, I don't have to act on each choice and experience each choice and follow through with all of the implications of each choice to be rational. I can just consider it, think about it, and then make a decision to do
Mm.
only one of them. So it's like, and if you want to just choices or theological beliefs, it's the same conversation. You don't have to believe in something to rationally consider it. So he almost makes it sound like because you believe in determinism that you don't have the ability to rationally infer because your mind's already made up. So it is like a
Mm.
secular, like you said, it's a secular argument that like he's basically saying by definition I'm right, and we would say by definition your definition's not correct. Like by definition you're having a different conversation than what we're having. So
Exactly. Mhm.
it always comes back to that too. It's literally it's this
Definitions.
it's the same it's the same how would you say, I would just call it bias. It's the same bias we deal with every single argument that somebody, oh, I disproved compatibilism or I disproved Calvinism with this one 400 word article. No, dude, no one's that smart. Like if it looks too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true. We've been talking about this for an hour and a half. We haven't even scratched the surface of a lot of this stuff. We're kind of skimming through it.
No, we
And this is already
we skipped
a
a lot.
huge conversation. And it's like, dude, I feel like people just want it to be a 10-minute video with, animations and aha got you statements and one liners, and then we're going to leave it at
Well,
that. And that's like
simple.
the theological intake that people want, because it's kind of a nature um or a byproduct of how we live now with like attention spans and everything needing to be immediate gratification. Like anybody can look at this, think about it for 5 minutes, and be like, I don't really know a whole lot about this, but like it kind of looks like it's correct and it's a quick read, and I can, there's a link and I can send it to people and be like, aha, got you, and pat myself on the back. And it makes
Mhm.
it really easy. And that's like what he's doubling down on. In the conversations we're having, it's almost a completely different language. Like this isn't going to be one like this conversation isn't gonna be won or lost on the backside of 400-page articles and like Twitter status updates or something like that. Like it's gonna be conversations that last hours. It's gonna be responses that are thousands of pages, and it's gonna take a lot of time and a lot of work that most people don't really care to do, honestly.
Actually, it's kind of hilarious because when I mentioned John Martin Fisher, I think he's probably the most well-known contemporary compatibilist today, and actually mentions him because he's responsible for guidance control, him and his colleague Mark Revisa, and he mentions him in footnote 9 with linking their book, Responsibility and Control. He just gives like literally a two-sentence reason why he thinks their whole view pretty much just is wrong. And I want to actually quote it because I think it's so awful. He says, the problem as I see it is that if ed is true, exhaustive determinism is true, then the manner in which one responds to reasons, the how, is also causally determined by something else. So one can be determined, Stratton says, to reason poorly and determined to respond to reasons incorrectly. And this seems to run into problems. Right there, Stratton just doesn't understand reason's responsiveness or guidance control because he doesn't understand exactly what I've been belaboring about and speaking of with the determining mechanisms. He brushes it all underneath one determining mechanism. He just, oh, it's determined. Oh, okay. So that therefore bad.
It's
Like,
like
no, it's not.
I'm not
That's
voting
not how it works.
Republican. The orange man bad argument. Like there's a million
It's just
different
like
reasons not to vote for
he
Trump, but
says.
like
Yeah, he says the how is basically irrelevant. He says this in exactly the same way in his rejoinder to Bignon. Ed is ed, he says, and I quote: is Ed. The how one determines is irrelevant. I'm saying, oh my goodness, you have not given me a single sentence that shows your ignorance on the philosophy of freedom as much as you did in that one sentence.
So
And
he did say a
I don't
lot with very little.
like, but I'm saying, and I don't mean to be harsh because he's a brother in Christ, right? He's a brother, believes Jesus, he believes the gospel
It's
is
just it's
God.
part of a
Amen.
wider problem with with
Yeah,
theology
that's the thing.
nowadays.
Like, it is part of a wider problem. You can't just pop in popcorn theology like this or popcorn philosophy in little footnotes and expect it to be one and done. And then get mad when someone like us gives you a 2 hour response or like me, a 250 plus page reply why your theology is not correct. There's a reason why we come to these conclusions. You have to hear us out.
Yeah.
And this is the problem that I find with Stratton's overall demeanor when he approaches these topics. So while I agree this article is a little bit better than others, for the reasons that this whole video says, I find it wanting. I find it, I would reject premise three. If I reject premise three in that sub argument, obviously I would reject premise two in his core argument, which means no, incompatibilism is not argued, it's not defended. That doesn't prove compatibilism, sure. I don't need to prove compatibilism in order to show that your arguments are not necessarily up to par. So he needs to go back to the drawing board and give us better arguments for the incompatible I hate this incompatibility thesis.
I mean,
That's what he needs.
we just need to start on the same same starting line if we're gonna like run a race against each other, because we're not. We never are.
Yeah.
And like I said, like I think Stratton is just the loudest example that we have. Um, I mean, he puts this stuff out constantly, and every time I read an article by him, I the thought is like this is a I don't know if anyone's ever used this term before, but we are gonna popularize this term. It's popcorn theology. That's what it is. And what is that? It's a snack. It has no calories to it. He just pops in, makes assertions, and pops out. One done. It's all
Nutritious
over.
at all.
Yeah, it should. And it's I get why he's doing it, right? Because he's got a business to run. He's got this really popular website. He's got a book. He's trying to get people to buy. Um, a whole ministry built on this, which I would say good for you. Like go for it. But when you run into people like us that are consistently going against what you're saying, and if we're consistently saying you're misrepresenting our position, then I would just
Mhm.
say give us the benefit of the doubt, consider what we're talking about, and then just make up another argument. Like if it's that clear to you and you've thought about these things so clearly, I would be starving to hear a well put together argument for why like compatibilism isn't true. I would love it. I would be all for it. I'd be willing to
I
change
love
my
it
mind
too.
in a heartbeat. Trust me. I I have no personal ties to this theology outside of it makes the most sense to me right now. If I come across an article that makes a lot more sense to me, I'm dropping it in a heartbeat. And I've spent a year on the forums, I've spent a year talking to you, and I've spent my whole lifetime hearing all sorts of different theological positions. And it's just like they all fall short to this position as of right now. And I used to be someone who would argue against this stuff ardently, like wholeheartedly. I would tell people like in my college, I cannot believe in God if he is Calvinistic. If he operates like this, it's not a God I can believe in. For the sake of my own salvation, I have to believe in a more Arminian flavor of God at the time. And I was like, it drained me to have conversations like that. And like it was what do you call it? It was exhausting and like conversations with people at my school about this stuff. And I was like, I'm never changing my mind about these things. And what do you know? A few conversations with Colton where he made sense and I had no arguments. Like I had arguments, but he'd answer the questions. I had nothing to go off of aside from like I have to believe you're right for sake of not being able to prove that you're wrong. And I still see that to this day. I'm not seeing articles, I'm not seeing posts on the Facebook, I'm not seeing books coming out that show that we're wrong. I see people arguing with flavors of it that nobody really holds to, like sections of it that are not defined well, but I'm not seeing it being tackled head on. I see it being constantly misrepresented. And that's basically how it's been for a while in these theological debates. And stuff like this article is not helping at all. Like, I don't know.
We, as the podcast name, we care about truth. We don't. There's one time where Stratton in personal correspondence implied that the stake that I have with compatibilism is that I'm oddly committed to ed. I'm more committed to metaphysics than I am theology. And that, first of all, is bulveristic. It's a rhetorical fallacy, assuming my motivations for why I believe something. And it's awful. Don't ever do that. But secondly, that's not the case at all. I would 100% agree with you. I have no personal stake in compatibilism. I have no personal stake against Molinism or anything like that. I just find that it's false. I find that they don't meet their burden that they need to meet. And this is one such example of not meeting that burden.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's all we're saying. We care about truth. That's what we're here. Truth C squared. So we are telling it the truth, how it is, and why it is the case.
Yeah.
I don't want to do all like the podcast episodes on Stratton or individuals like this. This was just one time where I think it's important to kind of see what actual professional objections to the compatibility thesis is. I kind of want to cut it out, like the episode right here because it's getting late on my end. But next episode, we're going to come back to the models of providence, look at some of those objections, and show you why we do believe in the deterministic providence, why it is the best, I think. Yeah. Contrary to what Stratton wants to say, that mere Molinism is better.
Yeah. And I know this is like dipping your toes into an ongoing conversation that Colton and Stratton have been having for well over a year, maybe even 2 years. And Colton's been working on a response to his book that we might get into later once he's almost finished with it and go through a couple of those things. But like I said, it's just a symptom of a wider problem. I think that, starts with entertainment, starts with the education system and a lot of, especially the American education system. And then it bleeds into what gets clicks, what's, a good title that will get people intrigued and want to read, what's short enough to keep their attention span, and what's easily repeatable that you can say to other people to dunk on their belief systems. And part of my mindset is that I just have not cared about these conversations for so long that I was kind of blind to it, and I just got like the reasons I came to the beliefs I had was a long, hard conversation with a friend over months. It wasn't an article that I randomly found, and it wasn't affirming something that I wished was true the entire time. So I think that at the end of the day, if we're searching for truth, you're not going to find it on the internet in a 400-word article. Unfortunately, it takes work, and I would say you need to pray about it, you need to read God's word about it, and you need to talk to your friends, the spiritual leaders in your life, and have real meaningful conversations about it, and be willing to change your mind, and be willing to be wrong. And I would say on this podcast, like we right now are standing in a very hardline position for determinism and Calvinism, and that's kind of where we're at mentally right now. 5 years from now, you could come back and listen to something, the videos we're putting out then, and it's completely different. I don't know, but where we're at mentally is trying to get truth. And right now I feel like, you know, it's 30 below and I walked outside and it's like, dang, it's cold outside. It really feels cold. I have every reason to believe it's cold because I am freezing. And that's what I feel like Calvinism is like. Like there it's so hard to get around it. It's so hard to argue with it if you understand it in a accurate sense. It's just that obvious to me, and I don't know why it is, but that's just how it is right now, and we're gonna roll with it until we find something better. Which unfortunately, this stuff Stratton is putting out is not convincing either of us. It's just muddying the conversation as far as we're concerned, and it's annoying because we hear his responses echoed through other people all the time, and we always say the same thing: not you're not depicting our position accurately. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Love to have a conversation with you when we're speaking the same language, but that has been so hard to come across. But yeah, let's leave it at that. I got my little rant done for an hour and 45 minutes. So appreciate it. Timeline wise, trying to get this next video out. I'm not sure. But I do have exciting news that after Christmas, the week between Christmas and New Year's, me and Cole will actually be meeting together in person for the first time. And if, what, 3, 4 years? I don't know how long it's been. 2 years? I don't know. It's been a while. So I'll get to meet the baby. He'll get to see my kids again. And we might, if I can get it set up, record a video while we're there, maybe in person, which would be kind of a cool dynamic. And we might do something just random. It might not even be a continuation of the previous video. Hopefully we'll have that done before then, but it might just be something random and it might not have anything to do with philosophy. Maybe we just play guitar for 2 hours. I don't know. We'll see what we want to do, but I appreciate it. Like and follow, and I don't care. I actually don't. Just dislike this video if you watched it to the very end. So I know you guys did. Thanks.